All right, class, we're halfway through the semester. We are now on Chapter 5, Middle Childhood, in our summer class of Human Behavior in the Social Environment. This chapter will outline the topics of the historical perspective on middle childhood in the multi-generational family, development in middle childhood and formal schooling, special challenges in middle childhood, and then the risk factors and protective factors in middle childhood. So, as far as a historical perspective on middle childhood, historically, middle childhood represented a period during which children became increasingly able to play a role in maintaining or improving the economic status of the family and community. So, beginning in the early 20th century, there was a radical shift that occurred in the modern world's perception of children. Children were passing through middle childhood and they became categorized as school age, as outlined in your book, and then their education became a societal priority. So the book also talks about child labor and the compulsory education laws that supported and reinforced this shift in societal values. So right here in the United States and really all over the world, children continue to play important economic roles in the family. Many children from most of the impoverished families, they lived and they also worked on the streets, and they were in countries striving towards universal primary school education. And then the children must balance their economic productivity with time that they spent in school. So although this significant diversity exists among children, middle childhood in general was viewed in the United States as a time when education, play, and social activities should dominate their daily life. But some of those children used to have to work, and this was all before the child labor laws. So again, it was right at the beginning of the 20th century that we came up with this whole theme of school age and wanted to make sure that that formal education was a priority. So with middle childhood in the multi-generational family, the child's social world expands dramatically. And although family's not the only relevant force, it still is a very significant influence as far as their development. So right here we see that the child shaped not only by events and individuals in the present time and physical space, but also those that influence the lives of their parents, the grandparents, the great grandparents, and beyond. So when we go into this chapter a little bit more, we're going to talk about issues like divorce and the effects that it has on the child. If children live with just their parents, if they live with their grandparents, but all of these things influences, a child's development at this stage. When we look at physical development here, so in the picture, we see that all of these kids are 8 years old. So we see that they're different heights. Because all of them look like they're pretty much from the same country, I'm sure that they may share the same diet and a lot of things that are similar. So that's why it looks as if all of their weights are similar. But we know here in the United States, an 8-year-old can look like they're 11, or they can look like they're 6 years old. And, a lot of that, it can depend on hereditary issues, or it could be obesity, the way that they eat, lack of exercise. It's a lot of things that impact physical development in middle childhood. So here we see that children of the same chronicle age may vary greatly in stature, weight, and sexual development. There's an advancement of fine and gross motor skills in their physical development here. There's a lot of entrenchment or eradication of risk and protective factors that comes along with this, and we'll see a lot of that later on. And then many children experience puberty during middle childhood. In past times, it used to be like maybe when they were 13 or 14, but now you see children 8 years old that are starting their menstrual cycle, and then young boys, their voices are changing earlier, and they're just really going through the puberty phase a lot earlier. But then again, some of them are delayed and they go through this phase a lot later on. But there's increased public attention and self-awareness, which is directed towards various aspects of physical growth, skills, or activity patterns and levels deemed outside the normal range. And this is also important when we think about cognitive development, and we're going to get to that here real soon. So now we're getting into that cognitive development, and according to Piaget, they are entering into pre-operational thought, which is the discovery of rules and regularities that can be applied to new incoming information. Then we've got the concrete operations, which is the ability to solve concrete problems using logical problem-solving strategies. And then, of course, we have the formal operations, which is the ability to solve real and hypothetical problems using abstract concepts to understand people, situations, and events within their surrounding environments. One thing that I like to think about when we talk about cognitive development, so when we think about legal ages of drinking, ages of consensual sex, or even when we think about trying minors as an adult, I feel like it's always important for us to understand the brain development of children, of just humans, period, just all of our brain development. So if this is the phase where they're discovering the rules and regularities that can be applied to new incoming information, is it truly fair that they can be treated as an adult when their brain's not fully developed and they don't have the cognitive ability of adults? That's just one of those soapboxes that I get on, when we think about how brain development impacts judgment in certain phases and stages of our lives, and how the law wants to apply certain consequences, but they don't take into account the cognitive development of individuals at certain stages. So just make sure that in you all's profession that these are things you are considering when you're looking at the behaviors of individuals, especially those in middle childhood. So in the picture here with this cognitive development slide, we see nerve proliferation, which here it says that by the age of 11 for girls and 12 for boys, the neurons in the front of the brain have formed thousands of new connections. And over the next few years, most of these links will be pruned. And with pruning, those that are used are reinforced. And then the pathways involved in language, for example, will be strengthened, while the ones that aren't used will kind of die out. So when we're thinking about brain development right here, these things are true. However, there are some things that can disrupt this nerve proliferation and determine which of those nerves are actually pruned. So when we think about children who have experienced some type of trauma, now they're going in a fight or flight mode, and they're not thinking about things logically. They're kind of thinking in survival mode. So we also have to remember how those things affect brain development. So let's just make sure we always take everything into account when we're working with individuals and really understanding cognitive development in middle childhood. So prior to middle childhood, we see that brain development and functioning is profoundly shaped by early experiences and development. Brain development follows a coherent developmental process. So during middle childhood, the question of brain plasticity is the thing that we're really focused on. So there are different brain regions that develop according to different timelines. And then, of course, we're looking at the brain synapses and the way that they are creating and fine-tuning the brain synapses, which bring everything together for individuals going through this phase. I thought this was a really cool picture to put on here, and it says, growing up poor doesn't just change the way you see the world, it actually changes your brain. So we know that there's a variation in brain development and that it plays a crucial role in learning, emotional responses, and behavior. So there's identification and diagnosis of special needs peaks, and then brain-based behavior and learning style differences may be responsible for somewhat stable trends observed in gender differences and educational development. But it's very important to understand that certain situations that children are in, it definitely impacts brain development when they're in middle childhood. So we see here moral development in general. So it expands and develops into a more internally based system in middle childhood. The needs basic cognitive skills prior to incorporating authority or societal standards. Classical theories have been criticized for not including females and other minorities when we're considering moral development in general. So when we are expanding understanding of moral development, which is what occurs in middle childhood, Their moral behavior is shaped by daily experiences. So what they experience on a daily basis is what usually determines their overall moral behavior. So they respond to the way the child is treated in various environments. So if we look at a child who has both parents in the home, maybe mom stays at home, dad works, and it's those normal societal gender roles, you may get a different outcome versus someone who was raised by a single father and they lived in poverty and he had to stay at home and utilize some resources or welfare, if you will. That will definitely change the way that a child responds and their ability to distinguish between moral voices and actions of adults, because remember, it's all based upon and shaped by their daily experiences. So we see here that there are gender differences in moral development. So genders are distinct in their approach to social relationships and interactions. Such differences may shape the nature of development in all of the domains. So it is argued that girls possess heightened interrelational intelligence based upon emotional and social intelligence. So I had always heard that girls were 5 years ahead of boys, and that may be a myth, but those are some of the things and an example when we talk about the gender differences in moral and then intellectual development. So middle childhood is also a phase of their cultural identity development. So most children who are members of non-dominant groups, ethnicities, or race, they may be a central part of their search for identity. So you may have someone to come here from another country and they're trying to matriculate into this Western world. So they're really not feeling like they fit in. So most of the time, they kind of gravitate towards those who are similar to them. And that's really just a natural behavior for all of us, but it's really crucial during this stage of development. So here, children become aware of dual and multiple aspects of identity as they mature, as well as discrimination and inequality. So it may be a situation where when kids are 6 and 7, they don't realize, a kid who's poor doesn't realize they're poor because they have everything they want. But by the time they get to middle childhood, they are able to compare themselves with another kid 9 times out of 10 it's in school, and then realize that there's something different about the way they live versus the way that their peer lives. So again, the segregation is based upon race and ethnicity, and then social class is common in friendships at all ages, but here is when that starts to develop. So a particular challenge may be blending contradictory values, standards, or traditions. So we see here with the assimilation or identifying with mainstream American culture. And then there are stereotype vulnerabilities, where development of negative attitudes about cultural group membership is either consciously or subconsciously. So at this stage, they have heard all of these things about different races and different people, and we don't have to go into the tones that are going on right now with this president that we have, but a lot of people at this age were aware that there was something else going on. And even children in elementary school were a little bit worried about the things that they were hearing people say about our president and what was going to happen if he was elected into office and what were going to happen to certain minority groups. So here they were very consciously aware of negative attitudes about certain group members. And then the family is typically the vehicle through which cultural identity is transmitted. So you see a lot of families that move to the United States from other countries. The families, if they speak another language, it's the family that either makes sure that they are still utilizing the language in the home so that they don't forget where they come from or assimilate too much into the Western culture. So it's usually through the family vehicle that the cultural identity is transmitted. So here I want you all to click on the link so that you can see what ACEs means, which is the adverse childhood experiences, and how it impacts development among those in middle childhood, and it's going to definitely touch on emotional development. And then at the end of this presentation, I want each of you to actually take the ACEs assessment and then see how well you score on yours. So with emotional development, as most children move from early childhood into and through middle childhood, they experience significant gains in their ability to identify and articulate their own emotions as well as the emotions of others. So it's important to recognize, however, that culture and other aspects of group identity may shape emotional development. So here we see that there's substantial knowledge base regarding promotion of positive emotional development, and then there are complex factors that shape vulnerabilities. So as suggested, depression arises due to deficit in relationship skills and cognitive or interpretive styles. And then we also have depression and eating disorders that are disproportionately impacting girls during this phase of development. So when we look at social development, and Erickson's stages of development, right here in middle childhood, it is the industry versus inferiority psychosocial stage. And this is the drive to acquire new skills and do meaningful work. So I like to look at this more as children are walking into their own independence and finding themselves. So here we see there's a self-confidence is the most widely recognized developmental task of this period. It's a critical time to acquire enhanced sense of mastery and self-efficacy and an increasing awareness of the network of relationships in surrounding environments. So the development of social competency is the ability to engage in sustained, positive, and mutually satisfactory peer interactions. So this is where they're kind of moving away from the heavy influence of the parents, and they're more influenced and impacted by the opinions and interactions with their peers. So continue with social development. Each individual child's identity development is highly dependent on social networks of privilege and exclusion. There's a direct relationship that exists between the level of control and power a child experiences and the degree of balance achieved between feelings of power, which we know that is privilege, as well, and powerlessness, which is being excluded. And as children move towards adolescence and early adulthood, the amount of emotional, social, spiritual, and economic capital or resources acquired will determine the likelihood of socioeconomic and other types of success, as well as feelings of competence to succeed. So we see here that peer groups are nearly as influential as family members. So within peer groups, children potentially learn three important lessons. First, they learn to appreciate different points of views. Secondly, they learn to recognize the norms and demands of peer groups. And third, they learn to have closeness to same-sex peers. Their desire for group belonging becomes stronger. And then we look at their social competence, which is the ability to engage in sustained positive and mutually satisfactory peer relations. Because of this desire and ability to engage, this is how the influence of peer groups becomes nearly as strong as family members. And as we move on in different stages or different sections of this book, we'll see that the influence of family, it sets the foundation, but the older they get, influence of their peers becomes more and more important because peer acceptance is a powerful predictor of psychological adjustment later on. So when we look at friendship and intimacy, we also understand that throughout middle childhood, children expand their ability to look at things from others' perspective, and in turn, their capacity to develop more complex friendships are based on awareness of others' thoughts, feelings, and the needs. And then as a result, for many children, more complex and stable friendships begin to form for the very first time in middle childhood. So although skills such as cooperation and problem solving are learned in the peer groups, close friendships facilitate understanding, and they also promote trust and reciprocity among individuals in the middle childhood phase. Another theme is team play. So a lot of times people think putting kids in sports is just for the physical activity. However, there are more positive outcomes when we look at team play in middle childhood. And some of those things are the capacity for interdependence, cooperation, comprehension of division of labor, and healthy competition. So aggression during peer activities decreases in middle childhood, and then friendly rule-based play increases. So this is where we learn to be team players, and the skill set that we learn in middle childhood is the basis of how we operate later on in adulthood on our jobs. So we learn a lot of those things early in the middle childhood stage of development. So development of group communication and interaction, along with the ability to understand role of multiple participants in activities, allows for team play. And then we already discussed again the positive outcomes and some of the long-term benefits. Among most school-aged children, gender identity, or an internalized psychological experience of being male or female, is well established. But this is not, however, the case for all children. So many children experience a fluid sense of gender identity, particularly prior to the onset of puberty. So the book suggests that research indicates that the greater the gender dysphoria experience as a young child, the more likely it is that a child will continue to experience gender variance throughout adolescence. And then transgender children and youth are particularly vulnerable to social isolation as well as other developmental challenges associated with negative experiences in the family as well as in school settings. But these are according to studies in 2008 and 2009. So some years have passed since these studies, and as we all know, things are changing. Children during this phase are more accepted, no matter what their gender identity of gender roles are. So society is changing when it comes to societal perception of gender identity as well as roles. So these gender roles are derived from various theoretical perspectives, and we see here the anthropological or social constructionism theory, cognitive theory, behavioral perspective, gender schema theory, and then the feminist psychodynamic theory. So we've got the masculine and feminine roles are attributed, but then gender stereotypes become a little bit more flexible. But again, nowadays things are changing and people are more open during middle childhood when children want to identify their gender differently than they used to in past times. So when we look at technology and social development, technology presents children and the adults in their lives with opportunities for social connection that didn't exist in the past. So children can maintain and develop relationships despite their geographical location or any other separation that may exist. So social support positively influences children, and these relationships may promote the development of communication skills that are not supported through relationships initiated or maintained solely through in-person interactions. Now we see here that in affluent nations, many children are technologically savvy by middle childhood, and that again, technology presents children opportunities for social connections, communication skills, and exploration of their identity within relaxation. So there are unhealthy outcomes that include feeling more comfortable in a virtual setting or in a virtual identity, and then access of inappropriate information, and then the parents' use of the technology. So we have to be really careful with technology in middle childhood, and I would just advise parents to be cognizant of what it is that their children are looking at and watching, because these things impact the decisions that children make in middle childhood. Spiritual development here has been defined as awareness or an awakening, interconnection, and belonging, and a way of life. Usually, when we see individuals who consider themselves to be religious or spiritual, it's not just something that they do one day a week or on Sundays and Wednesdays or Saturdays. This is usually a way of life. And I think we can look at that in a sense of, if we think about religion in America, and then we think about those who practice Buddhism, if we think about Buddhists have a way of life. This is who they are, something that they do all times. And for them, this functions as a protective factor. Same thing with Catholics and other religions, but some religions just live it out more than others. So you can actually see that some of the traditions they have is a part of their way of life. And that's just all a part of their spiritual development. So, technique of spiritual listening may support children's development as it facilitates children's ability to link the concrete nature of their lives to the metaphysical part of their lives. So, I love this picture right here. To me, it is a perfect depiction of the United States education system and this whole core curriculum that we live by. So it says that for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And then it says that everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. So when we are looking at the school system, we see different kids from different cultures, um, different ethnicities, different learning styles, as well as different abilities. You may have some that's ADHD, you may have one that's developmentally delayed, and then some who are just highly advanced. So it's really unfair for us to expect everyone to take the exact same test, but everyone is different. So again, there continues to be a large global gap in opportunities for education. And during middle childhood, these individuals must learn to navigate school environments, and success in school is important to self-esteem, and they are becoming increasingly aware of an evaluation. So when we think about the No Child Left Behind reform, it gained a lot of momentum in the U.S. Department of Education back in the day. One of the things that it did was children weren't allowed to be held back in elementary school, and that I do believe that's still a law here in Louisville. So when a child is not permitted to be held back, you may have a child who isn't academically ready to be moved on. So now they're passing them anyway, and then they start out in a grade already behind their peers with an expectancy to be on the same level. So this law was not a good thing. It actually created a bigger educational gap among students, especially those children who are poor, those of of color, and then those from other countries who may have language barriers. And we see here that about 1 in 5 U.S. children speak a language other than English at home. So these children are already having issues, not that they can't comprehend, but it's the language barrier. So we have to really think about how to restructure the formal schooling system here in the United States if we expect to help children, especially during middle childhood. So here's another example of the No Child Left Behind Act. It's just all about testing, testing, and testing. And here, a student's asking, is this the test to test us for the test to see if we're already ready for the test? We're focused on these test scores instead of focusing on development in the middle childhood years. And children all develop at different rates and different stages. And so it's a lot of risk factors that are associated with children in middle childhood. And we're going to see some of those here shortly. But funding from government and corporate sources increasingly directed at the poor and then the low resource schools. So when we think about taxes being paid in one area, the schools have better resources versus schools that are in poorer or less fortunate neighborhoods. We also have to consider how poverty detrimentally impacts the caregiver's emotional health and parenting practices as well. And poverty is correlated with inadequate family, school, and neighborhood resources, and thus children experiencing family poverty are likely experiencing additional cumulative risk factors. So here are more special challenges in middle childhood. We've already looked at poverty. When we think about social and economic trends, parents of children must participate in workforce, and then children attend childcare. Childcare quality is less than ideal in the United States, and it's troubling because quality childcare is linked to physical, cognitive, emotional, as well as social development. And then more on poverty. The meaning of relative poverty for school-aged children is particularly profound. The child struggles with the normal developmental task of feeling included and socially competent. And then we have relative poverty sends a persistent message of social exclusion and incompetence. And then we also know that if a child is living in poverty, symptoms of malnutrition mimic symptoms of ADHD. So if a child is at school and they can't focus, a lot of people are quick to label them or diagnose them as this child has a behavior issue, but it could be that the child hasn't eaten. It could be that the child has experienced extreme trauma. So we have to look at all of the factors um, that children face or the special challenges in middle childhood. And then we see here family and community violence. In the United States, children are more susceptible to non-fatal physical abuse between the ages of 6 and 12. And then there's a disproportionate representation of children of color within child welfare systems, and it's caused by underlying relationships between poverty and race or ethnicity. So family violence is intergenerational in nature. And then childhood exposure to violence significantly increases the likelihood of mental health difficulties and violence penetration or perpetration or re-victimization. And then the high-risk behavior among children increases as their perception of family involvement and community support declines. And then there's a new thing that we've seen lately where you see a lot of community violence that's going on the news and in social media, and it has shown that seeing these things greatly impacts the thought process of not just children, but adults as well. I want to say that it falls on the line of PTSD, just seeing the violence happening to one of your own greatly increases the anxiety or your potential to be re-traumatized by seeing something like that, whether you've seen it in person or you're constantly seeing it on television or social media. Other challenges that face children in middle childhood are the mental and physical challenges. So we see here that disabilities such as ADHD, which causes children to be inattentive, impulsive, and exhibit hyperactive behaviors, is associated with school failure or academic underachievement. Um, and we have to ask ourselves, why are these things associated with school failure or academic underachievement? Is it because of the behaviors themselves, or is it that the school won't conform to the way that children learn versus forcing children to conform to the way of the school system? And then, of course, we have the autism spectrum disorder, which is diagnosed in about 1 of 88 children. It's apparent impairment in social interaction, verbal and nonverbal communication, and then there's a range of activity and interests. So children diagnosed with autism are extremely diverse, especially in terms of intellectual and communicative um, abilities and capabilities. So just being able to understand these issues in middle childhood as a social worker, if you're going into school social work, you be able to identify these behaviors in children and then know exactly what is needed to make sure that these children have a successful experience with their formal education in their middle childhood or school age years. Other special challenges are some of the emotional behavioral disorders or challenges that children may have. It's also important to understand the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and how that can impact and really change the way that a child receives education at this phase. So children are able to get an IEP or individual education plan where they have specific educational goals. They chart courses for ensuring that a child achieves as much as possible in the academic realm. That is a very, very important thing to read, is that IDEA, because in JCPS or Jefferson County Public School System, if the school states that they cannot provide a child with the free appropriate public education, then they actually have to pay for a private school. But that's something that they don't discuss here. So make sure that if you're working with clients who have children who have some of these issues, or if you have one yourself, that you read that Individuals with Disabilities Education Act so that you are informed and know your rights, or can help empower someone else so that they can be advocates for their children. And then we have to take into consideration family disruptions such as divorce, death, active duty military, parents, foster care. All these situations are stressful for children and can lead to a new situation, new people, new housing, new income arrangements, new roles, and new responsibilities. And children in middle childhood don't always know how to articulate what they're feeling as a result of a family disruption. So if you've been with someone and then you experience a divorce or a breakup, a lot of times parents are focused on how they're feeling and what it is that they need to overcome, and they fail to realize that the child now acting out in school, it's not because they have behavior issues, it's that they're trying to process this family disruption that is causing a disruption in every area of their life. And these cause problems in schools and other settings, because we have to be mindful of how these family disruptions affect the overall well-being as well as development of children in middle childhood. So as we come to the end of this presentation, we want to look at risks and protective factors in middle childhood. So some of the risks as far as a child or the individual, there are premature birth anomalies, exposure to toxins in the utero, chronic or serious illness, temperament, for example, difficult, slow to warm, cognitive delays, low intelligence, childhood trauma, antisocial peer groups, and then gender issues. So some of those protective factors are good health, personality factors where they have easy temperament, positive disposition, active coping style, positive self-esteem, good social skills, internal locus of control, balance between help seeking and autonomy. Then there's above average intelligence versus the cognitive delays, a history of adequate development versus the childhood trauma. And then they are actively engaged in hobbies and interests, and they actually have good peer relationships. Other risks include disruption in parents or families, insecure attachment. A parent can be insecure adult attachment pattern, single parenthood with lack of support, harsh parenting, maltreatment, family disorganization, or low parental monitoring. Some of those protective factors are secure attachment, positive and warm parent-child relationships. Parents are secure and adult attachment patterns. The parents support the child in times of stress. Effective, positive, authoritative parenting style. The household rules and structure. Parents are monitoring the children's behavior. Then there's support and involvement from the extended family, and includes help with caregiving as well. So families where grandparents are involved, or aunts, uncles, any type of extended family, that's always a protective factor that helps during these phases. So stable parental mental health is very important, and that is a protective factor. And then high parental expectations. So family models aspects of pro-social behavior. So the higher your expectations within healthy limits, and you're supporting the child and explaining things, all of these things are protective factors in middle childhood. So here we are at the end of this presentation. I'm going to let you all go ahead and read the slide for yourself, but make sure you remember to go ahead and take the ACEs test to see how you score and then how adverse childhood experiences impact individuals in middle childhood. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your week.